Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive.
We're glad to be here.
Today, we're jumping into the nations, part 1. That's lesson 4 in the second quarter 2025 Sabbath School study.
Right, the one called Illusions, Images, Symbols, How to Study Bible Prophecy.
Exactly. And this whole quarter, we're looking at how God uses these kinds of literary tools, especially in prophecy. So today's focus is nations. What does that term really mean in the Bible? And, what's its prophetic weight?
It's a big topic.
It is. Think of this as maybe your quick guide to get the key insights from the lesson.
Yeah, hitting the highlights.
And hey, if you find this useful, please do give us a like or follow, maybe subscribe, depending on where you're tuning in.
And share it. Someone else might find it helpful too.
Definitely. Okay, so let's unpack this idea of nations. Where do we even start?
Well, you really have to go back to the big picture, the grand story. Genesis and Revelation are like bookends.
Bookends? How so?
Well, think about it. Genesis introduces the problem separation from God, the tree of knowledge.
Right. Losing access to Eden.
Exactly. Yeah. And Revelation shows the solution. Reunion with God, access restored to the tree of life, the curse lifted.
Ah, I see. So Revelation sort of reverses the problems from Genesis.
Precisely. And understanding that arc from alienation to restoration helps us see why nations become such a key theme, especially in prophecy. It's all part of that restoration story.
Okay, that makes sense. And the lesson points out this recurring theme in Daniel and Revelation, worldly government.
Yes. It's striking, isn't it?
Yeah.
Humanity constantly trying to manage and control God's planet.
Like setting up their own systems.
But prophecy consistently shows these human kingdoms ultimately giving way. They don't last.
Unlike God's kingdom, Daniel 7.14 puts it so powerfully. Let me find it. Yeah. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him.
His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed.
And verse 27 says it again. It's a clear contrast.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, what's fascinating is how early these themes appear, back in Genesis chapter 10.
Genesis 10, what's there?
Well, you get the introduction of some really key political players, places like Nineveh, Babylon.
The ones that show up constantly later on, especially in the prophets.
Exactly. Genesis 10, 1-12 gives us that sort of foundational map. And right in there, we meet Nimrod.
Ah, Nimrod. Yeah, the text calls him a mighty one in the earth and a mighty hunter before the Lord. Genesis 10, verses 8 and 9.
Right. And at first glance, you might think, wow, impressive guy.
Sounds like a compliment, maybe.
But the lesson suggests, and the context supports it, that before the Lord here isn't necessarily praise. It could actually imply, defiance.
Defiance,
Yeah.
like hunting in opposition to God or building his kingdom in God's face, so to speak.
Sort of like that. Establishing his power despite God or in disregard of God's authority. So you see this spirit of rebellion, this human-centered power spreading really early on.
That's a really interesting way to read it. And it makes you think, why is rebellion sometimes so subtle?
It's not always shaking your fist at heaven, is it?
No. Sometimes it's just choosing our way over God's way, human solutions instead of divine ones.
Exactly. Prioritizing our own control. And that desire, even when it looks successful, sets itself against God's ultimate plan. It's a tension we still see today, isn't it?
Absolutely. That pursuit of power, self-reliance.
So how do we guard against that? That
Yeah.
subtle drift away from trusting God's authority in our own lives. It's something to ponder.
Definitely something to think about. Okay, so if we move on a bit in Genesis to chapter 12, we see a shift.
A big shift.
Genesis 10 introduced the Goyim, the nations, the Gentiles, right? Verse 5 says, "By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families, in their nations."
Setting the stage. And Revelation 14.6 echoes that later, with the gospel going to every nation and kindred and tongue and people.
Right. So after that setup in Genesis 10, God does something different in chapter 12. He calls Abraham.
Yes, Genesis 12:1-9. God calls him out from among those existing nations.
To start something new.
Totally new. The idea was a nation that was distinct, fundamentally different.
How so?
Well, the original plan wasn't for them to have a human king like the other nations. God himself was meant to be their king, their direct ruler.
Wow. So not just a different political structure, but a different source of authority altogether.
Exactly. Relying on God's wisdom, God's provision, not on human strategies and self-interest. Israel was meant to show the world what happens when people live in right relationship with their Creator.
And the purpose wasn't just for themselves, right? Genesis 12:3 says, in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed.
That's the core mission. They received incredible light, amazing privileges, but it was all meant to overflow as a blessing to everyone else.
But it wasn't automatic, was it? Just having the law wasn't enough?
Not at all. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5-9 really hammers this home.
Can you remind us what that says?
Sure. Moses is telling them basically, look, I've taught you these statutes and judgments God commanded. That he says, verse 6, keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations.
Ah, so their wisdom wasn't just possessing the law, but doing it. That's what other nations would notice.
Precisely. He continues, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. Their obedience was their witness.
Verses 7 and 8 talk about how close God was to them and how righteous the laws were.
But then verse 9 gives that crucial warning. Only take heed to thyself, and keep thy soul diligently, lest thou forget the things which thine eyes have seen. Don't forget, and teach your children.
So the responsibility was huge. Knowing the truth is one thing.
Living it out is another. That's what truly makes a difference. For us today, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so fast forward a bit in Israel's history. Things didn't quite stay on that ideal path, did they?
No, unfortunately not. There's a major turning point when they start looking around at the other nations.
And they want what the others have.
Exactly. A human king. We see this in 1 Samuel chapter 8.
Right. Verses 4 and 5, the elders come to Samuel and say, make us a king to judge us like all the nations.
And the lesson points out this wasn't just a request for a different leader. It was fundamentally a rejection of God's direct reign.
Ouch. Like saying, we prefer the human model, thanks.
Pretty much. We want to be like everybody else. And God tells Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me.
And Samuel warns them, doesn't he? He lays out exactly what having a king will mean.
Oh, yes. Verses 11-18 are quite the list. He says, the king will take their sons for his army and chariots.
Take their daughters for cooks and bakers.
Take their fields, vineyards, olive groves, the best ones.
Impose taxes, take their servants and livestock. Basically, it's conscription, confiscation, and taxation.
A pretty stark picture of how self-serving human power tends to become.
Yet they still insisted.
They did. And God, knowing their hearts, allowed it. But he didn't just abandon them to it. He gave them guidelines back in Deuteronomy.
Ah, right. Deuteronomy 17, instructions for the king.
Verses 14-20. Things like, don't multiply horses or wives or silver and gold excessively.
And crucially, he was supposed to write a copy of the law and read it every day.
Yeah, to stay humble, follow God's commands, and not turn aside. Those are the safeguards.
Safeguards that, sadly, history shows were, often ignored.
Very often, which underlines that point the lesson makes. All human governments involve sinners governing other sinners.
So the potential for things to go sideways is always there.
Always. And this whole experience of Israel wanting a king, rejecting God's rule, it kind of sets the stage for understanding temptations the New Testament church would face too.
How so? What's the parallel?
Well, think about how the church interacted with worldly power structures. Israel's history provides sort of foreshadowing.
Okay, like Jesus' warning in Matthew 20.
Exactly. Matthew 20, verses 25 to 28. Remember the context. James and John's mother asks for special positions for her sons.
Yeah, the other disciples get pretty annoyed.
And Jesus uses it as a teaching moment. He says, "You know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them." That's the world's model.
Power, hierarchy, control.
Right. Then he says, verse 26, "But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister.
And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant.
Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many."
So a complete reversal of the world's power structure. Service, not dominion.
That was the clear instruction. But what happened later in church history?
After the persecution stopped and Constantine came along, things changed.
Dramatically. The end of persecution was good, of course.
Yeah.
But then came this new temptation, leveraging state power.
Using the emperor's influence to, advance the church's agenda.
Which led down a path of compromise, didn't it? Merging church and state, adopting worldly method.
Leading to some pretty dark times, historically speaking. Seeking worldly power often meant losing that humble, servant-hearted focus Jesus taught.
And that's not just ancient history, is it?
No, definitely not. We have to ask ourselves, how do those same temptations, the allure of influence, power, maybe even just fitting in with worldly ways of doing things, how can they compromise our faith today?
Individually and as a church body, it's a constant pressure.
It really is. Okay, let's loop back for a second to God's original plan for Israel. We said it was to be a blessing, a light.
Yes, absolutely. The main goal wasn't judgment or condemnation of the other nations.
It was salvation, right? Showing God's character.
Exactly. By living out his ways, they were meant to reveal his righteousness, his mercy, his goodness. The ideal picture was that other nations would see this.
And be drawn to Israel, drawn to their God.
Yes, drawn in peace, wanting to learn. That was the ideal.
But often it went the other way. Like the Babylonian captivity, nations came in war.
Tragically, yes. Of course, the ultimate perfect demonstration of God's character was Jesus himself.
The perfect light. As John 3 says, God sent his Son not to condemn the world, but to save it.
And the church's mission today, it's the same as Israel's original calling.
To draw people to Christ.
Through reflecting his character, sharing his message, like the three angels' messages in Revelation 14, verse 6, going out to every nation and kindred and tongue and people.
And Revelation 18.1 talks about the earth being lightened with God's glory. So when we see nations in prophecy, it's not just about earthly kingdoms.
Yeah, it often carries a deeper meaning. It can be an allusion to past events, like Israel and its neighbors, or a symbol for broader spiritual forces.
Like Babylon.
Exactly. That's a huge symbol in Revelation. And understanding these layers, the allusions, images, symbols, is key to getting the prophetic message.
So passages like Numbers 14, where Moses pleads for Israel based on God's character.
Verses 17 to 21. And Isaiah is full of this theme.
Right, Isaiah 42.6, God calls Israel for a light of the Gentiles.
And 49.6, I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the end of the earth.
Isaiah 60, verse 3, and the Gentiles shall come to thy light. It's a consistent theme.
It really is. Then you get to Revelation 18, verses 1 through 4. That powerful call.
Come out of her, my people.
That ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. Come out of where?
Babylon. Which, as you said, isn't just the old city.
No, it's a symbol. A symbol of this whole system of worldly power, false religion, confusion, everything that opposes God.
So the call is still relevant. How can we, as God's people today, be part of calling others out of spiritual Babylon?
That's the mission. To live and share the truth in a way that draws people out of confusion and into relationship with Christ.
And speaking of compromise and worldly influence, the lesson brings in that quote from Ellen White.
Ah, yes, from the Great Controversy, pages 49 and 50.
She talks about the mystery of iniquity working gradually after the early persecution stopped.
Mm-hmm. How, almost unnoticed, heathen customs and practices crept into the church when it gained worldly acceptance and power under Constantine.
She says the church exchanged the humble simplicity of Christ and his apostles for the pomp and pride of heathen priests and rulers.
And substituted human theories and traditions for God's commandments. It's a really sobering description of that slow slide.
It really is a powerful warning about the danger of compromise, even when it seems like progress or acceptance.
And it forces us back to that self-reflective question again. Are we susceptible today?
Are we, maybe in subtle ways, exchanging that simplicity for something? Well, more worldly, more palatable, perhaps?
It's easy to think we're immune, but that might be when we're most at risk.
Good point. The lesson also poses a couple of really good discussion questions for further thought.
Yeah, the first one is about God using people outside of Israel, like Nebuchadnezzar.
The king of Babylon,
No.
the head of the system that destroyed Jerusalem.
Right. But God worked through him, and Nebuchadnezzar eventually acknowledges God. Remember Daniel 4.
Yes, and then there's Cyrus, the Persian king.
An unbeliever, technically. Yet God calls him my shepherd and his anointed in Isaiah, and uses him to release the Israelites from captivity.
So the question is, what does this tell us about God? His sovereignty, his view of all humanity.
It shows his reach is universal, doesn't it? He can work his purposes through anyone, regardless of their background or beliefs. It's quite profound.
It really is. And the second question hits even closer to home.
How much of Babylon is in us?
Yeah, not the literal city, but the mindset. The values, the priorities, the ways of thinking that are part of that worldly system opposed to God.
How do we even spot that in ourselves? And then what do we do about it? How do we seek that genuine transformation?
Phew. Big questions. Vital ones for us to wrestle with personally.
Definitely.
Okay, so as we start to wrap up this deep dive on the nations, part 1, let's just quickly recap the main threads.
Okay. We saw Genesis laying the groundwork, the origin of nations, the seeds of rebellion, but also God's plan for a special nation.
Right. And that constant tension between worldly government, human attempts at control, and God's ultimate everlasting kingdom.
We looked at Israel's story, their high calling to be a light, a blessing.
But also their failure when they desired a human king and wanted to be like the nations around them. Lessons there for sure.
And we saw how that pattern, those temptations, carried over to the New Testament church, with Jesus warning against worldly leadership styles.
And the ongoing call for God's people, at first Israel, now the church, to be a light, to reflect God's glory and call people out of the confusion represented by Babylon.
And tying it all back to our quarterly theme, we've seen how nations in prophecy isn't just literal. It's packed with illusions, images, and symbols that unlock deeper meaning.
Understanding these helps us grasp God's message across Scripture, and especially for our time.
It's a really rich study.
It is. And we really hope you'll keep digging into this. Go back to those Bible texts we mentioned.
Yeah, spend some time with them. And check out the recommended readings too. Ellen White's The Acts of the Apostles, pages 578 to 581.
Or the digest version, From Trials to Triumph. And that blog post mentioned in the lesson, Why Are There 360 Days to a Year in Bible Prophecy? Good extra resources there.
Definitely worth exploring further.
And one last time, if this discussion helped you, please hit that like or subscribe button, follow the page, and share it with others who might benefit.
We appreciate you tuning in.